Kia ora koutou katoa. How is everyone today? It's one of those things where we're doing our first webinar, but we can't see the audience, but we can certainly feel the audience, and it's generated a high level of interest. I think before we start, I should say that this is our first go at having an LDAC webinar. So it's a bit of an experiment. And so if you wouldn't mind just bearing with us, there might be a few glitches along the way. We'll try and do this as seamlessly as possible. It's also one of those things where, because this is new, we're going to ask you to do a bit of a poll at the very end of the webinar, and then there'll be a survey that appears in your browser at the end as well. So I'll remind you of that at the end. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about what LDAC is. We're going to have a panel discussion with Cassie and Carl, who I'll introduce after we've had that initial introduction, and then we'll take your questions and answers. If you want to ask us a question, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you can just fill in the questions there, and we'll pick those up with the panel after we've done that initial introduction and the panel discussion. If you have any further questions, you can email the Secretariat and we'll put that up at the end as well. So without further ado, we'll get underway with the presentation. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to LDAC 101. This is part of the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee webinar series. Through LDAC 101, you will meet some LDAC members, find out what LDAC is. What do these letters actually stand for? Hear more about how LDAC can help policy advisors and legal advisors. Understand more about how to engage with LDAC. It is a positive and helpful experience, as we'll outline. LDAC was established in 2015 by the Attorney General. It replaced the Legislation Advisory Committee. LDAC is an advisory committee with public service and external members who provide advice on legislative design to departmental policy and legal advisors. Members are appointed by the Attorney General. They include senior public servants and external members not part of the public service who have expertise in policy and legislative development. Currently there are 21 members, including 2 alternate members. LDAC is involved early in the policy to legislation process. The idea is to help as early as possible in the process to get the best possible legislative design that reflects the policy. And sometimes LDAC makes submissions to select committees on bills where there is a major legislative design issue. The legislation guidelines comprise 29 chapters which provide the principles behind making good law. They can be found on the LDAC website. Officials must assess their legislative proposals against these principles. The guidelines cover matters such as, will the bill be fit for purpose? Will it achieve its policy intent? And is it well designed? Are the rules, powers and institutions proposed appropriate? And should there, for example, be some safeguards around the powers? Will the bill be consistent with constitutional and international law issues? For example, will it affect the rights and interests of Māori under the Treaty of Waitangi? Will the bill provide for things to be done by regulation that should be done in an act? And are the proposed ways to achieve compliance and enforce the legislation appropriate? The principles and the guidelines are high level. LDAC publishes supplementary material that builds on these high-level principles. This supplementary material has covered issues such as judicial review, the use of exposure draft bills, purpose and principles, and commencement clauses. Engaging with LDAC on proposed legislation and using the guidelines and supplementary material will help you to deliver fit-for-purpose legislation, a smoother process in the House, and fewer major amendments during the Select Committee review and the Committee of the Whole House. Departments can ask LDAC for involvement when legislation bids are submitted and can approach the committee separately through the Secretariat based in the Parliamentary Council Office. A legislative proposal should be referred to LDAC if the proposal is a significant principal act or is likely to impact on the coherence of the statute book, for example, because of a significant degree of overlap or interaction with other legislation, or is likely to be inconsistent with the principles in the legislation guidelines, particularly those relating to the fundamental legal and constitutional principles. You may also wish to refer a legislation proposal to LDAC if the proposal raises basic framework or design issues or questions of instrument choice, or you consider the proposal would benefit from advice on how best to apply or ensure consistency with the legislation guidelines. There are likely to be several meetings with an LDAC subcommittee on a pre-introduction bill. Meetings are informal with a subcommittee of 4 LDAC members. LDAC is here to help policy and legal advisors deliver legislation that is best practice and reflects the policy intent. We hope the short 101 presentation encourages you to take advantage. So that's a short introduction to LDAC. We do hope that you see that as a way of taking advantage of the support we can provide. But we thought before we go on, we should do some just quick introductions. My name's Guy Beatson. I'm the chair of the Education and Engagement Subcommittee for LDAC and a member of LDAC, as well as the director of my own company providing consulting services. And I'll get Cassie and Carl to introduce themselves as well. Cassie. Oops.
Apologies. Kia ora koutou, I'm Cassie Nicholson. I'm Chief Parliamentary Counsel at PCO and also a member of LDAC.
And I'm Carl Simpson, so I'm the chair of LDAC and a policy director at the Ministry of Transport.
So what we're going to do next, on the basis of the short introduction, and if you've got questions as we go along, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom. We'll monitor those, and I'll ask those questions of Cassie and Carl when we get there for that. So first up, we're going to just explore a little bit about who LDAC is. So Carl, where do the members come from, and how is LDAC composed?
Thanks, Guy. I think it was pretty well covered in your presentation, but I mean, the key points there are that it is a mixture of public service and non-public service members. It's about half and half. And people in the committee are drawn from policy backgrounds as well as legal, social policy, economics, people from legal teams within departments. We've got some members from some Crown entities. We have academics involved and barristers and consultants like you, Guy. And the idea here is that making good law is a multidisciplinary process, and you can't really attack good legislative design just from a legal lens. You need to bring those other points of view to bear on a legislative problem.
That's true, and I guess Cassie, when you look at that, Carl's touched a little bit in terms of the value that comes from a committee composed the way it is. But do you see other things that are valuable in having the committee composed the way it is?
I mean, exactly what Carl said, I guess, that multidisciplinary perspective, because good law is not just a legal issue. It's a question of, obviously it does have a constitutional dimension, but just as much, and just as importantly, there's a whole spectrum of policy and legal choices that you make along the way, and implementation choices that really affect how well you translate what you want to do in terms of policy into legislation on the page, and then into real life, of course. The kind of issues that come up, like how well it's going to adapt for the future, or how it will fit with the wider legislative and legal system. Those are choices that the barristers out there and the academics and the public servants all have a really valuable place to contribute to.
And I guess the other side of that is with that multidisciplinary approach, you have a bit of fun in terms of the different perspectives people bring to it as well. So
absolutely.
Part of what we're trying to do here is sort of think about what LDAC actually does, and while this is introductory, so we're not going to get into too much depth about what LDAC does and some of the key issues. I guess, Cassie, in terms of the primary activities of the committee, what do you think they are, Cassie?
Well, our kind of day-to-day contact with the system, if you like, comes through our bill subcommittee work, and that's probably of most interest to the people here today. I mean, that's where we get to examine those bills and help people with those conversations on how they fit, you know, how they measure up against the guidelines and what they need to, how they need to evolve for good design. We do also have that touch point at select committees, so we can scrutinise bills before Parliament and provide submissions to select committees, which is really useful at times too. And of course, we're there looking after the guidelines and supplementary material to support them. So that's our touchstone, as it were. And then lastly, but not least, of course, sessions like today's, our education work to try and you know, get out there and talk to people about what it means in practice.
Yeah, and I guess the critical thing with that is we're actually, like today, we're trying something different. So trying to sort of step up a bit in terms of what we do. I guess one of the interesting things from an audience perspective, Carl, is exactly what sort of issues that the Legislation Design Advisory Committee is getting into. Do you want to give a bit of a brief rundown of some of those key issues?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's always a little bit different. Every bill throws up some arcane issue and some big policy issue. But some of the key things that we face and the policy advisors and legal advisors are facing when they come to us are, you know, how to turn a broad policy objective into something that's legislation on a page. And you know, there is quite a big gap, or a place that needs to be bridged between, you know, between some of those high level policy objectives, whether it's around climate change or safety legislation, and the expression of that in black letter law. And so what we're working with departments on, and identifying the policy objective and the purpose in the legislation, and trying to find out how best to express that purpose or the objective in the legislation itself. So that's probably one major area. One of the other issues that that often comes to us without departments being in a final view is the relationship between the new legislation and the existing law, because you know, it's not normally the case that you'll have an entirely new area of law. We're always hunting for those, but you know, there's not often the case that you get to start from scratch. And so the relationship between, you know, the new policy or the change in policy and the existing legislative framework or common law framework, key part of, you know, our value add really, because there's not that many people at that stage in the process that can provide some advice on that stage. Perennial issue is the appropriateness of subject matter for an act or secondary legislation. That's something that comes up, you know, probably at least 60 or 70% of the time will be, you know, what the right balance between primary and secondary is, what guidance should be done, should be provided in the legislation for the exercise of secondary powers, the relationship between administrative role and lawmaking role, that kind of thing is something we face all the time. And whether new statutory powers should be created, who should hold the power, the nature of that power, does it best sit with a minister, does it best sit with an official, do you need to create a separate decision maker and appeal rights and things, those sorts of implications.
Yeah, and it's a pretty important key list of issues to make sure that we actually get good legislation, right? And I guess a small plug for the future of the webinar series. A bunch of the things that Carl's talked about we'll pick up in future webinars in a format very, very similar to this. So watch out for those.
Yeah, those just
the end of the advertisement.
Yeah, those are the items we're going to put out in our annual report, which will come out soon. And that's actually a good place to look back also on what we've looked at in previous years. So we use our annual report sometimes to outline some of the trends that we're seeing and the types of things we've advised on. Actually, just to make another plug, we also spent quite a bit of time developing a briefing to the incoming Attorney General as well. So that's also on our website. So there's got quite a lot of material out there about, you know, how we operate and the things that we've seen.
Yeah, so I guess we should encourage people to go to the LDAC website and just have a look at some of those things, particularly that briefing as well as our own report. I guess that does lead to a question about why LDAC exists as well. We've covered some of that, but do you want to, Carl, just address the question of if LDAC didn't exist, what gap would it create in the system?
it's an interesting question to ask the people who are responsible for being in LDAC, but I'll try and give it a go. I mean, we would still have the guidelines. The guidelines are a piece of, we inherited all the work of the predecessor entities going back 4 decades. So that the guidelines themselves are a very important part of essentially our constitution, really. They talk about what good lawmaking means in New Zealand. But without us, we would struggle to maintain those guidelines, and they do need to be constantly refined and updated. We do face new problems and new trends in legislation that need to be adapted. It's also the case that reading the guidelines is not a substitute for engaging judgment, because they are just guidelines. They're kind of they're things to think about, and in some places you do get to close to firm rules, but in most cases those things require the exercise of judgment. And what we do at LDAC is to try to help departments to exercise that judgment and feel their way through to the right solution in that particular policy problem.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one way to look at it. I'm going to turn to Cassie though, because somebody said to me the other day that it isn't the case that you don't really need LDAC, because actually you've got the Parliamentary Council Office and Parliamentary Drafts people who have all of the stuff in their head anyway, and they just do it. So what's the benefits and value added by engaging with LDAC in addition to the sort of stuff that occurs with the Parliamentary Council?
Well, I guess I would say, Guy, that it's not either or, is it? It's an and I mean, having all those 3 perspectives in the room, which is LDAC instructors and the legislative drafters from PCO, is a really helpful thing, because you all come at the issues from a slightly different angle. And it's absolutely true that lots of your drafters will be thinking about exactly these issues. How do you translate policy into good legislation, split between acts and secondary legislation? These are all issues we face every day when in actually picking up the pen, as you like. But one of the great things LDAC adds, I think, that supports that process is an earlier point of engagement, because it's usually coming to LDAC before it comes to drafters. So a chance to really shape the thinking for as it goes up to ministers. So well before drafters would normally get involved. And also that extra multiple perspectives of the policy and the regulatory and the barristers, and all of that thinking coming to the fore, which adds that multidisciplinary perspective that we like.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to translate from those abstract sort of guidelines issues into concrete things, just really great to get that.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And the critical thing about that, though, is that while not everyone on the committee has a legal background, they at least understand how the law gets made, and most of them have been involved in that stuff as well. I wonder whether we might just turn to how LDAC does its work, and picking up that all again, Cassie. It's a case of what's LDAC guided by?
Well, the guidelines are our touchstone, obviously, and the mandate that Cabinet's given us to kind of by signing up to those guidelines is really significant. I think then in terms of how we apply those into real life, the bills that come through us, that is, the understanding and the conversations that happen between the members of seeing those recurring issues come back again and again. But then really in terms of what do we focus on, if that's a kind of useful perspective, there's a triage list on our website that I think really helps you give a sense of the kinds of issues of complex choices, which are really great for us to give our input on. So it's the complex and difficult stuff, but also maybe it's the stuff where there's a great opportunity to improve design. So new bills are there because new principal acts are there because there's more benefit from good design than just sort of targeted amendments. So it's both the complex and hard and the great opportunities, if you like. I
guess the other question people might be asking, though, is what's the basis of the guidelines? When they sort of look at these things, and I guess some people would say that they're pretty arcane in some areas, although they've been tidied up more recently. Where do they come from?
Well, they do come from years of work. I've dug out old papers from, maybe 20, 30 years back. And and the various sort of LAC and the LDC previous committees before LDAC. But so there is a lot of thinking that sits behind those, but their value really is in constant refinement and rethinking. As Carl said, the issues do change and the pressure points change. So we've got, things like our use of purpose clauses, supplementary material, which is really kind of adjusting to that problem space. And then some issues are perennial, like split between acts and secondary legislation.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, right? I mean, the notion that says actually these weren't kind of invented out of thin air, and they follow kind of the kind of legal framework in terms of precedent and stuff like that is pretty important in this context, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, Carl, just turning to you in terms, so Cassie's talked about the guidelines and how they guide what LDAC does and how it does its work. Can you tell us a bit more about, given you're chairing this and you've steered where the committee's gone, tell us a bit more about the operating model for the committee?
Sure, thanks, Guy. So I'd say that we continually evolve our operating model. Our key underlying concept is that we're trying to influence how the system works and try to influence them with our touchstone with the guidelines. So the current way that we operate is that we use, as your presentation said at the start, we use the ledge bid process to create a prioritisation. So we identify those bills where departments have said, as they're required to make the choice of ledge bids, whether or not they wish to come to us. We also look over the other ones where they haven't mentioned coming to LDAC. We apply a prioritisation model to that. We engage with PCO. We engage with our members who actually have some knowledge of those pieces of legislation as well. And then we create essentially a list of bills that we think we should be involved in. We liaise with those departments, schedule when they will come. If bills don't make our priority list, that doesn't mean that we don't ever want to see those people. We are, open when there are legislative design issues for people to contact our awesome secretariat and see whether or not this is something that we should add to our priority program, or even to provide email advice, which we're doing a bit more of recently. And then the department would normally schedule a time to come to meet with us. They'll provide us with a short briefing. We'll get together a subcommittee of members. Normally those subcommittees will involve both internal and external, or public service and non-public service members of LDAC. There's a little bit of administrative process to set that up, but that's going more and more smoothly now, and it's really quite a fast process. And then there'll be a meeting where the department will talk to what those issues are. We'll have a long and discursive conversation about the legislative design issues, kept to an hour and very well chairs by each of the subcommittee chairs. And then we'll normally provide a letter of advice that will consolidate those views, and we'll have a bit of reflection and provide the advice that's anchored really back to the guidelines to the department. And that's kind of how the normal first engagement will go, and depending on the bill and the speed it's going through the development process, we'll see it maybe 2 to 3 times more after that. Sometimes we'll be involved in consultation on the cabinet paper. We should always be involved if there is a reference to our advice. And then the bill will be introduced. Sometimes we provide advice to the Attorney General. Normally so that's essentially the pre-select committee process. We have been involved on occasion with helping departments during the select committee process and providing advice, particularly where it's more of a trend recently where select committees are asking for LDAC's advice or asking what we advised on things. Now, our advice is owned, in our view, by the department. So, we're happy for that advice to be provided to the select committee as long as it's discussed with us first. We need to be able to understand what the content is. And we have appeared alongside officials on a couple of occasions. So that's kind of I'd say that call it sort of the in the tent process. So the work on the bills that is really within government. We also provide advice through submissions to select committees. Now that's normally as a that's as a normal submitter. So we will provide advice. Provide a submission to the select committee. We'll either ask to be heard or not be heard. We'll make a presentation to the select committee. Select committee may ask officials to provide views on our advice, and we're wearing a different hat, and that's fair. So we wouldn't be advising the department at the same time. So we, in terms of the balance between the work we do in for submissions and on bills, we're probably running at about 3 to 5 submissions to select committees per year. That'll grow or get lesser depending on the types of issues that are arising at select committees and the balance between our internal work and our external work. Both of them are very important, though. I think we would be missing something if we were only doing the pre-introduction work, or the in-the-tent work and the outside the tent. Then other things we do, so we've got standing subcommittees on guidelines, and so they've got a work program on maintaining the guidelines up to date and fit for purpose. And then we have a separate committee that Guy chairs, that's the Education and Engagement Subcommittee. This webinar is part of that process, but we do a range of other things as well. And I think that's mostly what we do. We're a small group of people. There's there's around 20 of us. Everyone's operating as a volunteer, and we gratefully receive both the departments who are loaning people because they see stewardship or good legislative design and improving the system as part of their role, but probably more importantly, the private sector people who are giving up their time for free to provide benefit to the system. That we're very, very grateful for their efforts and helping to really out of a sense of public responsibility or public good to provide input on good legislative design. So I think it's kind of essentially how we're operating.
Yeah, no, it's really useful. And it's a really, really comprehensive rundown of where things are. I guess the other people we should mention are the Parliamentary Council Office, because that's the host for LDAC, but also the Secretariat. You've touched on that a little bit, but they provide really, really good resources and allow us to move forward on a bunch of that stuff.